It's quiet and sterile in the research room, exactly the way it's supposed to be. The hum of controlled air, the occasional shuffle of footsteps on carpet, the soft crack of a binding opening for the first time in decades somewhere behind a bookshelf you can't see. The light is gentle and indirect, designed to protect the documents more than to help you read them. The room exists in a kind of reverent haze, as if the place itself knows it's a keeper of memory. You sit at a wide table, and your eyes scan slowly a selection of materials pulled from the Schuyler Colfax collection, carefully labeled folders, cotton gloves, soft supports for fragile bindings. You lift the cover of one folder and find a handwritten letter dated June 1865. Schuyler Colfax's distinctive script slants upward, his hand steady and neat. It's addressed to a political colleague, written just a few weeks after the end of the Civil War. The ink is a little faded, but the purpose is clear. He's making plans. He's going west. Nearby is a worn copy of Across the Continent, the travel narrative penned by journalist Samuel Bowles. It's not just a book, it's a record of the first great American political road trip, and spoiler alert, Schuyler Colfax is going to be front and center. You flip through pages describing dusty stagecoach roads, 4th of July celebrations in frontier towns, and long, hot days crossing vast open plains. Colfax sees the future out here, and in his own words, the endless plains and towering mountains inspire a sense of awe and opportunity, and the towns we passed through seem to hold the promise of a prosperous future. Beside the book is a small envelope labeled Campaign Materials 1868. Inside are printed handbills and correspondence from Colfax's run for vice president, a run buoyed in part by the fame and goodwill earned on that summer's journey west. There's also a speech, annotated in pencil, delivered in California, in which Colfax calls for reconciliation, infrastructure, and unity. His steady voice, even on paper, is filled with optimism. And then there's a photograph. He's younger here than you would expect after such a long and illustrious career. But then remember, by 1865, Schuyler Colfax was into his 6th term as a congressman and had spent 2 years as Speaker of the House, and he was still just 42 years old. You sit with all this evidence, letters, speeches, photographs, a book filled with dust, distance, and American history, but really, where are you? Like on a map, where are you? Maybe you're in some national archive in Washington, D.C.? Afraid not. Maybe you're in South Bend, Indiana, thumbing through the vast Schuyler Colfax collection at the History Museum? Nope, you're not there either. You're in Provo, Utah, a place Schuyler Colfax only ever visited once, but a place that never ever forgot him. Colfax's visit provided legitimacy for the burgeoning Utah territory and reconciliation for a place and a people whose relationship with the federal government had been contentious at best. That's why you'll find such a vast historical collection of Schuyler Colfax's legacy at a most unexpected place: the Research Library at Brigham Young University. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into the life of South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's explore a completely different aspect of Schuyler Colfax's life. Colfax's legacy is, rightly, defined primarily by his political place in and around the Civil War, the collapse of the Whigs, the founding of the Republican Party, anti-slavery sentiment, the conflict between the states, Reconstruction. We've spent plenty of time talking about that, and we'll spend plenty more time talking about it in episodes to come. But of course, those weren't the only things that Colfax was politically interested in. There were his post office reforms, for one, and then there was the other big one, his obsession with the American West. It was 1865, in the days after the Civil War ended, that Schuyler Colfax first drew up his own plans for a Western pilgrimage. He intended to depart in April of that year, and in fact, some accounts even suggest that it was his own planned Western tour that caused him to turn down an invitation to join Abraham Lincoln for that fateful trip to Ford's Theater. Of course, we all know what happened during the play, and the assassination of the president put Colfax's pilgrimage on ice, at least for a short while. But by the summer of 1865, Congress was on recess, and Colfax had since sold his newspaper interests in South Bend. He had no children and no wife. He'd been a widower now for 2 years. Schuyler Colfax was a free agent, and he would not be the first or the last man in a similar situation to set out for the West, to see the world, and to explore the great wide open. This wasn't just a vacation, and Colfax's words weren't just political rhetoric. The nation had just endured a civil war and was reconciling with what it meant to reunify. The South was left reeling by their sound defeat, and now that slavery was outlawed, their economy was left in shambles. As for everyone else, they were left reeling at the shocking assassination of their president. Colfax saw the West as America's best chance for healing, and he described it over and again as a beacon of hope and unity as the nation attempted to heal itself after a war. None of this was a new idea for Schuyler Colfax. He'd been talking about it since before the war, and writing about it since before he became a congressman. In the mid-19th century, the idea of manifest destiny was sweeping across the country. It was a bold, sometimes controversial belief that the United States was destined by Providence to expand its borders all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. The jury's out on whether or not Colfax fully subscribed to the religious and supernatural currents that tended to flow through manifest destiny narrative, but he was a staunch supporter of American expansionism, if for no other reason than that it sounded like a very good idea. One of the earliest and most significant ways Colfax acted on this belief was through his strong support of the Homestead Act in 1862. This landmark legislation opened millions of acres of public lands to settlers willing to improve it, typically by farming or ranching. For many Americans, especially immigrants and working-class families, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to own land and build a future. Colfax championed the Homestead Act in Congress, framing it as a law that would democratize land ownership and empower hardworking families. He believed that encouraging settlement in the West wasn't just about geography. It was about giving every American a stake in the nation's growth and success. This idea of empowering citizens through land ownership was central to his vision of an inclusive and prosperous America. At the same time, Colfax was a fierce advocate for another transformative project, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Authorized by the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, this railroad would literally connect the east and west coasts by rail for the first time in history. Colfax recognized the immense economic, strategic, and symbolic importance of this project. He often described the railroad as the great artery of national life, a phrase that captures how he saw it as the vital link that would bind the vast and varied regions of the country together. The railroad would carry goods, people, news, and ideas across thousands of miles, making the West less distant and more integral to the nation's economic and political fabric. When the rail line was completed in 1869, it became one of the most important early celebrations that could be shared by Americans in the North and the South. Yankees and ex-Confederates alike. From before he entered into Congress, and more than 10 years before the Civil War began in earnest, Colfax gave speeches and wrote editorials that spoke of the West as the thing that would bind together the fragments of the Union and of the beacon that would lead us forward. In those years, Colfax had hoped that the task and the opportunity of settling the West would be something that Americans of disparate interests could rally around together, but he might have been a little too optimistic about that in the 1850s. Instead, the West became just another thing to fight over. Remember that Colfax's professional political career was launched largely because the North and South couldn't agree about how the West would handle slavery. The promise of the West hadn't brought the country together, so much as it provided the spark that would tear it apart. But now, with the end of the war and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the argument was off the table, and it was time to try again to test the promise of the West. Schuyler Colfax packed his bags, and he was ready to make the trip. We'll hop into the wagon with him right after the break.
You gave all to Uncle Sam. Now make sure you're compensated for your sacrifice. If you were injured in battle but haven't received your injury pay, visit A.S. Dunbar, War Claim Attorney, now practicing out of number 5 Oddfellows Hall. Did a loved one pay the ultimate sacrifice? A.S. Dunbar works with widows and children of those killed in the service. The government has funds set aside for those injured and killed during the Civil War. Make sure you talk to A.S. Dunbar to receive yours. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
When Schuyler Colfax stepped onto the platform at the starting point of his western journey in summer of 1865, he wasn't traveling alone. This wasn't a quiet getaway or a solitary sabbatical. It was a political road trip and a high-profile journey that Colfax knew would attract attention. That was a big part of the point. So when it came time to assemble the travel party, Colfax was shrewd enough to surround himself with friendly allies who knew how to get the word out. There was Samuel Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican in Springfield, Massachusetts, one of the most influential newspapers in New England. Bowles was the most high-profile correspondent on the trip, and the one who would assemble what would become the book about the journey. The title's a mouthful. Across the continent, a summer journey to the Rocky Mountains, the Mormons, and the Pacific States with Speaker Colfax. Bowles wasn't the only newspaper man on the journey. He was joined by correspondents from New York and Chicago. Ever the politician, Colfax wasn't just worried about who would tell the story. He was invested in who they would tell the story to. Colfax was plenty known in Washington and across the Midwest, and he didn't think he'd ever be able to win the sympathies of the South, so bolstering his own name recognition in the Northeast was of tantamount importance. As for Bowles' book, it would go on to be a phenomenon and a bestseller, Schuyler Colfax its leading man, main character, and star of the show. There were already beginning the whispers and rumors that Colfax might be a presidential candidate in 1868, and though he publicly shrugged off those suggestions, he was savvy enough to know the power of being seen, and being seen in the West was powerful indeed. They set off from the Missouri River, beginning their journey where the rail lines stopped and the wagon roads began. It was the same place that hundreds of similar journeys along the Oregon Trail had begun for decades, and where they would continue for several more years, at least until the railroad was completed. The agenda had been set for months. From D.C. to Missouri, across the plains, into the Colorado and Utah territories, and then an extensive tour of the state of California. On the way back from the Pacific coast, a northerly route, back through the relatively new state of Nevada and the Wyoming Territory. The travel was difficult at times. Roads were primitive, bridges were few. Every mile west required patience and endurance, but it was also exhilarating. For men like Colfax and Bowles, who had spent their lives behind lecterns and newspaper desks, the vastness of the plains and the open sky felt like something out of Scripture, a reminder of just how much of the country still lay ahead. Colfax took notes constantly, often in the form of the letters that would later be compiled into the book Bowles would put together. He sent dispatches back to South Bend that were printed in the newspapers. His observations were keen because, of course they were. Remember, Colfax had still spent more of his life as a writer than a politician. He remarked on the industriousness of settlers, the immensity of the open land, the diversity of the frontier communities. His tone was almost always optimistic. Even in the roughest patches of road or the sparsest encampments, Colfax saw opportunity. In a post-war America desperate for symbols of unity and healing, Colfax's presence in the West sent a clear message. The Union had held, the war was over, and now national leaders were turning their eyes to something bigger, building a future, not just rebuilding the past. It also mattered who wasn't on the trip. The South was conspicuously absent, geographically, politically, and emotionally. The former Confederate states were in chaos and under military occupation. They were no longer in the Confederacy, but they weren't quite into the Union yet either. Meanwhile, Colfax was on the plains, visiting mining towns in the Colorado Territory and Mormon settlements in the Utah Territory, demonstrating that the work of the Union government was not just to mend the East, but to cultivate the West. The trip elevated the profile of the American West. It took the nation's eyes away from a fraught past and focused them instead on a bright future. There was also another message in there, one that did not directly speak of the South, but one that very deliberately ignored the old Confederate states altogether. The wealth I have seen in the West, Colfax wrote, leads me to predict that the United States will soon be called the treasury of the world. Entire books could be written about the layers of meaning in this brilliant sentence, but I'll give you just a few sentences right now. Before the Civil War, cotton had been the nation's most valuable export, and you already know how that cotton was harvested. It was slavery that made the South the driver of America's growing wealth, and now that period was over. At the end of the war, the former Confederate states didn't have many bargaining chips to renegotiate their relationship with the Union, but they could, and did, point out that it was in America's best financial interest to get the Southern economy rolling as fast as possible. Colfax's Western tour took that chip off the table. Colfax opened the nation's eyes to a world where America's wealth would come from the West, not the South. And as for the American West, it was a place unbound by a fraught past and untainted by the stain of rebellion. If the former Confederate states didn't want to play nice, the rest of the Union would be able to move on without them. The opportunities out here were boundless. The further west they traveled, the more the journey began to resemble a political campaign trail. At nearly every settlement, every fort, every river crossing, Schuyler Colfax made time to speak. Sometimes his words were formal speeches from makeshift pulpits. Other times they were off-the-cuff remarks shouted from a wagon or offered around a campfire. But always, he struck the same tone, one of unity, progress, and promise. Bowles was superfluous in his praise for Colfax, saying that speaking was as natural for him as swimming to a duck. But for Colfax, this wasn't just a parade of speaking engagements. It was a listening tour, a way to gather the voices of a changing nation and to remind people he met that the federal government saw them, heard them, and planned to include them in the future being rebuilt. One of the most fascinating aspects of the journey was the sheer diversity of encounters. This was a frontier in transition. Colfax met with miners in the Colorado Territory who spoke of silver, gold, and ambition. There he gave them a message from the late Abraham Lincoln. Remember that Colfax had intended to go on his journey earlier. It had been postponed after the death of Abraham Lincoln. Colfax had been with Lincoln the evening of the assassination and had talked eagerly of his Western journey. Lincoln asked Colfax to deliver the following message to the miners he would meet on the way. Mr. Colfax, I want you to take a message from me to the miners whom you visit. I have very large ideas of the mineral wealth of our nation. I believe it practically inexhaustible. It abounds all over the western country, from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, and its development has scarcely commenced. Tell the miners for me that I shall promote their interests to the utmost of my ability, because their prosperity is the prosperity of the nation. And so that's what Colfax told them, and he believed it, just as the president had. But it wasn't all gold in mountains and unlimited wealth. Colfax also came face to face with a more complicated reality: native nations whose lands this expansion threatened. In Wyoming Territory and again near Fort Bridger, the Colfax party passed through areas where wagon trains had been attacked in the past, but not this time. Perhaps it was because of a tenuous peace, but more likely it's because the Colfax wagon train, in Bowles' own words, bristled with the munitions of war like a fortification prepared for assault. Still, there were encounters. Once, the wagon passed through an area just a few days after an attack, serious enough that Colfax sent a letter to his brother-in-law with words that should be given to Colfax's own mother in case of the congressman's untimely death. But again, the wagon train equipped like a small army passed through unmolested. He noted in one letter, "We met a party of Shoshone riders, proud, wary, and regal. Their children stared at our wagons as though from another world." If Colfax romanticized those meetings, Samuel Bowles was even more direct. In Across the Continent, he describes indigenous resistance in terse and often dismissive terms, reflecting the biases of the times. "The Indian problem," Bowles wrote, "must be answered with firmness and progress," a telling phrase that revealed the assumptions embedded in the project of Western settlement. The issue was a difficult one fraught with political landmines on all sides, and for his part, Colfax seems content to have stayed out of it. He would have to toe the line all over again when he got to the Utah Territory and encountered another group fraught with political issues all their own. The Mormons, most technically their most well-known branch, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Salt Lake City in 1865 was a bustling and orderly settlement, still largely isolated but far from primitive. There, Colfax met with Brigham Young, the charismatic and controversial leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The meeting was cordial and strategic. Colfax, representing the federal government, sought a relationship with the Mormons that was peaceful and pragmatic. Young, for his part, wanted recognition and protection for his people's way of life, and was right to be skeptical of the federal government. The meeting with Colfax came just a few years after the end of the Utah War, a conflict between Young's followers and federal forces. In his letters, Colfax acknowledged the industriousness of the people and the promise of their settlement, even as he gently reinforced the supremacy of federal law against polygamy. He even told Brigham Young directly that statehood was out of the question so long as his followers practiced polygamy. When Young claimed that polygamy had come as a divine revelation, Colfax is reported to have told him to get a new revelation. But at the same time, he was quick to strike a conciliatory tone in public. He wasn't about to risk another national divide. "There is a great energy," he wrote, "and with it a longing to be both distinct and embraced. It is our task to ensure they are not left behind nor allowed to drift away." It was political poetry, measured, intentional, and possibly infuriating for those who wanted the man to just take a side. But Colfax hadn't come to judge and destroy. He'd come to observe and listen. Across the West, he was seen as the face of an American government that desperately wanted to bring the West closer into the fold, and more importantly for Schuyler Colfax, he was simply seen as the face of the American government. As they moved into Nevada and then California, Colfax's reception turned more enthusiastic. He gave speeches in Virginia City, Sacramento, and finally San Francisco. Crowds came to see him not only as the Speaker of the House, but as something more, a man of vision, a national leader willing to make the hard journey, a politician with dust on his boots. In every way, Colfax was becoming a more modern politician. Colfax's wagon train was the first group of Eastern dignitaries to tour the sights of California, to see Yosemite, to gaze high at the great redwoods and sequoias. Years later, the seeds planted during Colfax's trip would bloom when President Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act in March 1872. But most of all, the trip solidified the idea of a connected nation and Schuyler Colfax's high place in the middle of all of it. Bowles noted it best. The plains showed his resolve, the mountains his endurance, and the people their affection. Colfax, it seems, has walked into the West and walked into the hearts of many. The goodwill would only keep rolling when the journey was over and when Schuyler Colfax came back east. We'll catch up with all that and more after the break.
Are you in search of a chair that's as sturdy as it is stylish? Look no further than the Huey Chair Company, proudly situated along the West Race in South Bend. Founded by Virgil, Melvin, and Milton Huey, we've been crafting fine seating solutions since the 1860s. With backing from esteemed figures like South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax, our commitment to quality is unmatched. Choose Huey Chairs, where tradition meets innovation. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By the time Colfax returned from his western pilgrimage, the nation was already beginning to turn on Andrew Johnson, the man who descended to the presidency after Lincoln's assassination. Northerners found him too sympathetic to the South, and Southerners weren't really predisposed to like any Union president, no matter how sympathetic he was. No one found him to be very effective, and the best set of words to describe his general personality would probably be abrasive and off-putting. Johnson was a Democrat, chosen by the Republican Lincoln as a unifying gesture and an olive branch towards Southern states who would soon be reluctantly re-entering the Union. It is almost certain that Lincoln would have never chosen Johnson if he'd ever considered that he himself might die in office. But Johnson had been the choice, for better or worse, and mostly for worse. That didn't mean there weren't other politicians ready to oppose him, and Schuyler Colfax was primed to rise to the moment. As the Republican Speaker of the House during a Democratic presidency, he was already arguably the most powerful Republican in the nation. Now, thanks in large part to his expedition, Colfax was also the most visible Republican in the nation. The Midwest adored him and called him their own. Washington respected him. The Northeast was just getting to know him, and if you believe Bowles, the West loved him without reservation. And if there were any voters left who disliked Schuyler Colfax, then at least they probably disliked Andrew Johnson more. The newspaper dispatches from 1865 kept Colfax in the news for an entire year. When Bowles released his book Across the Continent in 1866, all eyes were on Colfax all over again. Readers across the country devoured tales of rugged terrain, industrious settlers, Colfax's visits to mining camps, Mormon tabernacles, and the rocky passes of the Sierra Nevada. The book wasn't just a travelogue. It was a campaign document in disguise, one that painted Colfax as a man of foresight and balance, someone who could speak to the industrial future of the East, the agrarian roots of the Midwest, and the wild promise of the new American West. He was optimistic without being naive, ambitious without being overbearing, and patriotic without being inflammatory. Even while Colfax denied any presidential ambition, the political class wasn't buying it. Newspapers speculated that he was angling for higher office. Western editors praised his energy and vision. Eastern papers applauded his moderation and decorum. Republican operatives, especially those wary of more polarizing figures, saw Colfax as a safe, appealing choice to broaden the ticket. But we'll save that story for next time. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will follow Schuyler Colfax through the campaign of 1868 and all the way into the White House. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.